this must be the worst climate bill that has ever passed in terms of comparing it to future climate bills. Because if it's not, if this is the best it gets, we are really, truly ecologically screwed.
All of those disgruntled people, all those people living paycheck to paycheck, like a plurality of Americans, they're finding somewhere else to go.
Our job, non-politicians' job, is to ask basic fact-based questions. Like, for instance, why does a climate bill include an expansion of fossil fuel development? This bill sets up a frantic race. We definitely need a lot more people in Congress who are willing to actually play hardball.
But David, how do we even... But David, come on. Like, this is the issue. And many people were upset about Bernie Sanders going on TV last week and saying exactly that. I'm so glad to be joined again on Bad Faith Podcast by David Sirota. You know him as the founder of The Lever, one of the best sources of news to understand what's really happening on the Hill, one of the leftists with the greatest degree of institutional knowledge of what's actually happening in D.C., and moreover, an amazing creative talent who was the co-writer of Don't Look Up, a movie that gets proven righter and righter every single day that passes. Welcome back, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay. Now, you are at the epicenter of this ongoing conflict that often happens once the Democrats pass something, which is leftists will raise some concerns about misrepresentations about what a big deal this, in fact, actually is, what a bill actually does, whether the pieces of it that are being heralded are actually going to come to fruition in a timescale that Democrats are actually going to get credit for. So I want you to tell us what you've been experiencing around the coverage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And maybe we should start with specifically the climate piece, since that's the piece that has gotten the most, heralding as unprecedented from the mainstream liberal press.
Well, look, it is certainly true that the bill is unprecedented in the sense that the government has not been doing much of anything for the last 30, 40 plus years to combat the climate crisis that it knew about. And so now it's doing something. So I guess that is, in a sense, unprecedented. It is historic if we're starting from zero. So that's certainly the case. But I don't think necessarily unprecedented and historic necessarily means that it's enough or even nearly enough. One of the top line takeaways from the bill that has been repeated ad nauseum is that the bill reduces carbon emissions or is projected to reduce carbon emissions by 40%. That is not accurate in the sense that doing nothing, according to the same estimates, would result in carbon reductions, emissions reductions of about 30%.
Wait, how is that?
Well, basically, current policy in terms of moving coal plants offline, in terms of natural gas replacing coal plants, in terms of existing renewable energy build out, solar and wind, that's already scheduled and projected, that would get us about 30% of the reductions. And then, so the bill, the projections say the best projections say, meaning the rosiest, say it would add another 10%, which is not nothing. I mean, that's something. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning that some of the key projections are based on studies that don't release their methodology. Others are based on very, very aggressive, rosy predictions about what as yet uncreated technologies will glean, things like carbon capture and a hydrogen build out and the like. And so even mentioning those 2 points, right, this only actually would increase, in the best scenario, reduce emissions by an additional 10%. And some of the projections aren't releasing their methodologies or relying on sort of very aggressive, arguably overly optimistic projections. Questioning anything like that, much less some of the fossil fuel goodies in the bill, has resulted in kind of a very aggressive and hostile pushback from the Democratic media machine, right? I mean, there was this Slate column that came out that I'm not encouraging people to read it, but it was sort of, it was incredible. It was actually cheering the idea that the Democrats' bill rejects what's known as the supply side fossil fuel argument, which is there's a part of the climate movement that has said, listen, we have to listen to scientists who are telling us overwhelmingly, we have to stop new fossil fuel development in order to meet emissions targets. And this sort of Slate column celebrated the idea that the Democratic bill rejects the idea of keeping fossil fuels in the ground, rejects the idea of limiting fossil fuel supply, or at least keeping fossil fuel supply constant and not building out more fossil fuel infrastructure. And so Slate was celebrating this as a big own of the left, a big win over progressives. Now, again, I'm somebody who helped create the movie Don't Look Up. So I'm focused on what is the science telling us versus what is the bill actually doing. And so on top of the emissions projections and the potentially overly rosy estimates is the fact that it's undeniable that in the legislative text of the bill, it includes a big build out of fossil fuels in two huge ways. One, Joe Manchin got put into the bill a provision that effectively ties the expansion of solar and wind infrastructure development to an expansion of oil and gas leases, offshore and onshore. And he went on Fox News and he bragged about this. And he was accurate in how he described it. He said, that essentially renewable energy expansion cannot now happen without an expansion of available areas for the fossil fuel industry to drill offshore and onshore. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is this side deal that hasn't been fully fleshed out, but has been acknowledged, that Manchin got the Democrats reportedly to agree to expedited permitting processes for fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines and the like. And by the way, the side deal is not included in any of the emissions reductions estimates that we just talked about.
So how do we even know about this side deal?
Because Schumer's office and Manchin's office apparently kind of leaked it out there. There was a leaked draft of it that came out. Bloomberg News found it. And
wait, so they purposefully want us to know that they're finagling behind our backs to undermine climate efforts by cutting deals for Joe Manchin?
Well, Manchin is bragging about it because there's a big pipeline in his state called the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which
that people have been fighting for years because of the environmental impacts. It goes through aquifers, would jeopardize the local water supply.
Right. Environmental groups say that the emissions that would come from that one pipeline alone could be about the equivalent of putting 19 million new cars on the road. So that Manchin is going out saying, hey, look at what I got for West Virginia. I got this big pipeline. And of course, and kudos to the New York Times, a very rare story. It did a story about how the natural gas companies that will benefit from that started pumping campaign cash into his campaign. He's the number one recipient of oil and gas cash in the U.S. Senate. So the point is that then mentioning, hey, listen, why does a climate bill expand the potential for fossil fuel development and include a side deal allowing a big build out of fossil fuel infrastructure? I think that's a legitimate question. Now, look, politicians can make their arguments. They can make their arguments all they want. They have to make deals. I need Joe Manchin's vote. We need this. We need that. They can make that argument. Arguably, that's their job, is to justify what they're doing in the Congress. My point is, as a journalist, as somebody who cares about the difference between climate science and climate legislation, my job, and I would argue our job, non-politicians' job, is to ask basic fact-based questions. Like, for instance, why does a climate bill include an expansion of fossil fuel development? Why is this acceptable? Why, when scientists are screaming at us that no new fossil fuel development must happen in order for us to meet emissions targets, why can't we even be talking about that in the context of legislation that inarguably expands the potential for fossil fuel development? And I think the answer to that is that we live in a political moment where inconvenient questions on all sides really aren't allowed if they violate a kind of tribal ethos.
Yeah.
In this case, the Democrats are, quote, winning. The Republicans are, quote, losing. And anybody who raises questions about the actual details is outside of that kind of frame. I mean, I ask a simple question, another simple question. If it's a climate bill, why is ExxonMobil's CEO celebrating it?
Yeah.
If it's a climate bill, why is Shell Oil celebrating? And I think those are important questions. And I go back to, frankly, the Iraq War. I go back to the lead up to the financial crisis, where questions about the veracity of the intelligence, questions about the veracity of projections about what financial deregulation would do, those questions similarly really weren't allowed. And you'd hope that we would mature enough to be able to ask those questions when it's a crisis that literally threatens all life on the planet.
Yeah, I gotta say, I don't know if it's just my own bias as someone who works in the media, but the longer that I'm in this space and the more moments like this happen, the more I come to the conclusion that the failure of the fourth estate is central and the but-for cause of the worst aspects of the moment that we live in. Because the calculus is this, like what you're saying about, okay, maybe it is true that Manchin, you got to get Manchin's vote and compromises had to be made. And it's the politician's job to make the case for why they made those kinds of compromises. But what doesn't factor into that calculus is how much you have to compromise with Manchin if he actually takes the requisite amount of heat for throwing his own constituents under the bus, constituents in West Virginia that don't actually want to live in one of the most polluted states in the entire country. And they don't get to hear what's really happening and the full picture of what compromise is being made at their expense if the media doesn't at least ask those questions.
It's 100% true that the political calculus is if the politicians never even have to explain the deals, if they never have to defend the deals, if they can just run out and say, we won, and they can expect the entire pundit class and the media class to call what they're doing a win, and no one's going to ask inconvenient questions, then there's no deterrent to putting a whole lot of crap into every piece of legislation. There's no deterrent to making sure that the details of legislation don't potentially undermine that legislation. I mean, I just go back to the idea of different roles. I think we have a problem in this country and in this society where lots of voters now, especially Democratic voters, see themselves as essentially pundits, see themselves as political strategists. In other words, there's a lot of folks who've been conditioned through cable TV news, through shows like The West Wing, frankly, all sorts of inputs to say, instead of seeing a climate bill and asking, is this going to help the climate in a real way, in an adequate way? The first question for a lot of liberals, Democrats, is this a win for my party? And if it's a win, then I'm not going to ask any other questions because that's the only thing that matters. And here's the thing, especially when it comes to climate change. Climate physics don't care about political wins and losses. Yeah. Climate physics doesn't care about deal-making and excuses. Climate change doesn't care about what's the best news clip on MSNBC. The only thing that matters in the fight against climate change is the physics, right? And I'm granting the idea, I have said this from the beginning. If you ask me, is this bill better than nothing? If you force me to answer that question, I would probably say there's a good chance, a decent chance, that it is marginally better than nothing. But it's a huge gamble precisely because they tacked on so much fossil fuel giveaways to the bill, right? Yeah. And I think, here's the thing, in my view, that is an honest take. That is as honest as I can be, right? It's not going to satisfy folks who are going to say everything about this bill is terrible, it deserves to be voted down. It's not going to satisfy folks who say this is the greatest bill in the whole world and shut up. But I feel like the fact that we can't have just an honest admission about this is a problem, especially politically, for this reason.
Yeah, I mean, we've been told about climate cliffs for years, since I was a fifth grader looking at a poster of a polar bear on an ice floe. We've been told that it's not just, yes, it's linear in some respect, but then there were these huge cliffs that occur if we don't meet these various, tipping points, if we don't prevent these various tipping points, rather. It's like being told you're facing a guillotine. and someone is like, Brianna, don't worry. We've rigged the guillotine, so it don't come all the way down to sever your neck. It only comes halfway down, So like celebrate. Like, no, my friend, I'm dead either way. And in fact, that second way sounds a lot more painful.
Well, and here's the other thing. If this bill is sold as the greatest bill in the world, that is historic, unprecedented, it will tell a lot of people, hey, listen, we solved the problem.
Exactly.
Everything's fine.
Yeah.
And the real problem with that is that a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah.
A lot more needs to be passed. I mean, here's the thing. Just on the funding side, the good funding side, right? $360+ billion for renewable energy, okay? Over 10 years. That's about $37 billion a year. That compares to about $800 billion a year for the regular non-war Pentagon budget.
Yep.
So we're only doing a tiny amount of what we obviously need to do. And yet it is being sold as effectively solving the problem when in fact, if the rosiest I can be is this bill has a decent chance to marginally improve things, and we need to do a whole hell of a lot more. And if you sell this bill as singularly solving the problem, you're making it harder to actually do those more things.
$40 billion to Ukraine, $37 billion a year to the climate. It's an interesting sense of priorities. But let me ask you specifically, David, you said that, okay, we're only getting 10% more toward the climate goals than we would if we hadn't done anything with this bill. What are the mechanisms being deployed here to even close that much of the gap? You mentioned that it relies somewhat on technologies that aren't even in existence. I read stories about how some of the incentives to buy electric vehicles, there's no electric vehicles that qualify currently on the market. We're having these, supply issues where the thing that it can help apparently doesn't even exist. So what is allegedly supposed to work in this bill?
I mean, the big one are essentially tax credits for a build out of renewable energy, and that those tax credits are there to incentivize and encourage a build out of solar, wind, renewables, and the like. And I think those investments, heat pumps, et cetera, those investments I think are very good. But that's only a piece of it. There's another piece of it that relies on unproven carbon capture technology, which the oil companies love because it basically says, listen, they can keep burning fossil fuels, pumping fossil fuels, and we will develop this magical technology that will capture the carbon before it goes into the air or even while it's in the air and puts it deep into the ground. I'm not saying that can't be successful. I'm not even saying that kind of technology shouldn't be studied because we are in such a crisis. But the point is that relying on that for a large chunk of reductions when it's unproven, I think is concerning. There's also projections that a hydrogen build out will reduce carbon emissions. I think hydrogen has some potential, but again, unproven as a fuel source essentially at scale. So I think these are problems, and I think when you couple that with the fact that it's linked to a build out of the kind of energy sources we know are exacerbating the problem, fossil fuels, that's why this is such a gamble. And why are we still gambling, right? And I think that's a political question we should ask. Why are politicians still selling the so-called all of the above energy idea? And the answer, I think, is because the Democratic Party, classic, doesn't want to choose between various sets of donors. The best politics you often get out of the Democratic Party, which isn't very good, is we're just going to write a big check to everybody, villains, good guys, everybody in between, and hope it works out, right? I mean, they did that with healthcare on the Affordable Care Act. Hey, listen, we're going to expand coverage. Okay, that's good. But what we're going to do is we're going to shovel a whole bunch of money to the insurance companies and the drug companies that are actually creating the problem. And so we may expand insurance coverage, but we're not necessarily expanding medical care. And so in this case, what the Democrats did was they cut a giant check to everybody effectively in the energy industry, even though the science is literally saying, hey, wait a minute, all of the above doesn't work. You have to actually choose. But the Democratic Party doesn't want to make tough choices. And look, the politicians, just to go back to this, the politicians can argue that they couldn't make a choice because they had to get Joe Manchin in a 50-50 Senate. I actually think that there is credibility to that in theory. Where I come down, though, in questioning that is where I think you come down, which is you haven't even tried to pressure him. You haven't even tried to embarrass him. You haven't even tried to make him vote on things that he doesn't want to pass, but put him on the spot. You haven't even tried that.
And the narrative has been, he wasn't going to get on board with any of this before. That's why Build Back Better failed. And when you ask why it is that he signed on to this bill, the answer that I've received and that has been reported is, oh, well, he felt pressure. He felt the heat. He felt it from within his own state. And it's like, well,
exactly.
Wait. We've been told for 2 years that no amount of pressure in the world was going to work. And now you're telling me that whatever magical pressure manifested in the last couple of months is what finally did it? Well, then it seems to me that you need to put a lot more pressure on.
Absolutely. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to do that.
But David, I also want to ask you this because you have been so instrumental in helping me to understand some of these procedural factors that the Democratic Party routinely hides behind. You were here on the show explaining the mechanisms behind the $15 minimum wage being stripped out of the American Rescue Plan last spring. And this moment felt very familiar in a lot of ways, with Bernie Sanders advocating to have all of these amendments put back into this bill, which of course requires 60 votes to get them in. And of course, when the parliamentarian rears her head and dictates policy to the United States of America and says that various things have to be stripped out of the bill, that could be ignored. Chuck Schumer, Democratic leadership, takes them out of the bill and turns what should be a 50+1 vote into a 60 vote. How many parallels do you see between what happened here this time and what happened last spring with a must-pass bill and the $15 minimum wage being stripped out of it?
It's the same thing. I mean, they just ran it back, right? I mean, they just ran the same playbook back. And just to refresh everyone's memory, in this case, the parliamentarian who was to be very clear, the parliamentary advisor to the U.S. Senate who serves at the pleasure of the majority leader. So in other words, somebody Chuck Schumer can replace or ignore. This person is effectively advising him and the Senate about what is allegedly in and not in order under the Senate rules.
To be passed by budget reconciliation.
Right. So the reconciliation bill comes down. The parliamentarian says that, for instance, on the Medicare drug pricing provisions, says that this provision that would effectively reduce prices for people in private insurance. It was sort of a fee to kind of punish drug companies for jacking up prices on people who get employer-sponsored medical care. The parliamentarian says that has to get out. Right now, in that situation, what could have happened is Chuck Schumer could have fired the parliamentarian. If he didn't want to fire the parliamentarian, what he could have done is they could have kept the provision in the bill. The Republicans raise a point of order, say, hey, this isn't good under the rules. The parliamentarian says so. The parliamentarian then says to the Democratic senator in the chair, Vice President Kamala Harris or whoever is in her place, the parliamentarian can say, hey, they're right. It doesn't fall within the rules. And the presiding officer, aka Harris or who's ever there, can say, I'm not listening to you. No, it's my ruling. I'm the elected person, and I'm just ignoring that. And this is staying in the bill. Then the Republicans would have to try to overrule the chair. And the Republicans would need 60 votes to overrule the chair. The Democrats could have done that. Mm-hmm. That's not what they did. Mm-hmm. What they did was the parliamentarian said this stuff has to get out. The Democrats took most of it out of their bill. And then it left somebody like Bernie Sanders to go to the floor and try to add it back in. And that would require to essentially waive the point of order, as it's called. That requires then 60 votes to add the good stuff back in. And so you had a situation in the Senate. This is the one that kind of blows my mind, although I'm not surprised by it. You had a situation in the Senate where Bernie Sanders put forward an amendment to add a reinstatement of the expanded child tax credit into this bill, a wildly popular program,
right,
and a wildly successful program. All the Democrats and all the Republicans voted it down. The Democrats said they were voting it down to preserve the deal, this fragile deal. The Republicans voted it down because they're assholes. So the expanded child tax credit gets voted down, and like literally a few minutes later, the Republicans bring forward an amendment to provide a special $35 billion tax break to the private equity industry, Wall Street, their Wall Street donors. And all of a sudden, Democratic Party unity, that's gone. That's not being enforced. 7 Democrats join with the Republicans to pass it. So you had a situation where in a course of like an hour or two, the Senate was like, yeah, we're not adding the expanded child tax credit back. But hey, our private equity donors, like our billionaire private equity donors, here's a special $35 billion tax
It's
break.
disgusting.
That literally
it's
happened.
Disgusting.
It's gross.
And they get away with it, David. They get away because nobody knows. I did a radar on this last week using your reporting from the lever. Thank you so much. I don't even know what I would do without you, truly.
Thank you.
And there's so many of the comments. You know, the Hill is a kind of I would say center to right leaning audience.
Sure.
In the audience, if you read the comments under that video, it's holy smokes. I had no idea they could do this. I had no idea they could get away with this. I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, I'm a libertarian, but it's really important to know how they're pulling the wool over our eyes because they expect us not to be able to track this. And that is why, David, I want to just really validate you for a moment. That, you know this, you don't need it to hear it from me, but that is exactly why you become the focus of so much liberal ire. Because there are very few people in this sphere who both have the chops and expertise to know better and who have kind of the mainstream, you know, I have existed in the world of journalism, I've existed in the world of politics, I've had mainstream jobs, I'm not like a fringe bread tuber or anything like that, who can drive these kind of messages home. And all they can do is shriek at you and tell you are somehow a bad faith actor because the truth that you articulate is so critical to the people understanding how they are being disempowered, chiefly in this instance by the Democratic Party.
Look, I want to be clear. We cannot write out of the story the Republicans.
Well, of course,
but I agree with you.
The story is here. We don't have any expectations from Republicans. What we have expectations for is Democrats not undermining their own effort, happily taking things out of the bill when they don't have to take it.
They control the tactics.
And then crossing the line to go ahead and allow Republicans to pass their, Wall Street agenda.
I mean, that was, to me, and there was another, if you want to know how messed up the Senate is, I mean, this one also blows my mind. Because they played this game with the parliamentarian. Remember, we went over how if they had done it differently, they would have needed, the Republicans would have needed 60 votes.
Mm-hmm.
So they played this game specifically with the insulin cap, where the insulin cap, the parliamentarians said it had to get out. The Democrats could have ignored the parliamentarian, then the Republicans would have needed 60 votes to overthrow them. In this case, the Democrats made a big thing. They went out and we're not going to listen to the parliamentarian. I remember seeing this headline. It was actually at the Hill. I was like, oh, wow, this is interesting. They're actually going to, for all their worshiping of the parliamentarian, not going to. What they did was they did the thing where they didn't ignore the parliamentarian, but they allowed it to be a situation where they needed 60 votes to add it back into the bill. So they staged this vote where they actually got 7 Republicans to join them because it's such a powerful issue. And the vote, and so the insulin cap doesn't get added back into the bill on a vote of 57 to 43. But then the private equity tax break is put into the bill on the same vote count, 57 to 43, because it was a tax issue that the parliamentarian ruled as within the realm of a normal Senate procedure, normal Senate vote.
So not a reconciliation issue. So it had a lower threshold to get back in?
Exactly. You only needed, it was a straight up tax issue. It wasn't a point of order, not to get too deep in the weeds. But my point is, you pull back, you had a situation where a 57 to 43 vote couldn't add an insulin cap into the bill, but a 57 to 43 vote could add a $35 billion tax cut for the richest people on Wall Street. That literally happened.
It's horrifying, David.
It is.
It's horrifying. I want to sit with that for a second, because like there's something that compels one in this media cycle to brush past this. Like leftists are all already dispirited and depressed about this whole thing. Centrists don't give a fig. Republicans are chortling and rubbing their hands together and are completely focused now on Trump and Mar-a-Lago and all of that. And it is crazy to me that this should be something that if it were me, if I were a squad member, a progressive in Congress, if I were Bernie Sanders, I wouldn't let this go. Just like, I'm sorry to listeners, I haven't let go of the $15 minimum wage debacle from last spring.
Yeah, you shouldn't let it go.
You should be getting, every time you have an opportunity to get on TV, this should be the case that you're making. Every time Bernie Sanders and the people they still let actually go on cable news to make a case, have that opportunity, this is the kind of thing that should be driven home. And yet we don't see that. And I want to ask you what you make of, David, what you make of the idea that Bernie keeps getting put in this position. Of course, it is true that the same way that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema can hold up anything in the Senate, Bernie Sanders can as well. We have heard this argument that because the left and progressives actually want good things to happen, that they are not able to shoot the hostage, as it were, in the same way that conservatives are able to shoot the hostage. But at what point are you sitting there as Bernie Sanders being told, oh, we're going to strip the stuff out of the bill because of the parliamentarian in order to save the bill? At what point do you say, okay, well, let me tell you something. Either way, if you strip these things out, it's not going to enable you to save the bill because I'm going to kill it at that point. So leave it in and let's get an up-down vote on these kinds of issues. What do you make of that strategy and Bernie's choice not to do something along those lines?
Well, I think on this bill, it was very close in this way. I think it truly depends where each senator, each politician comes down in trying to calculate, honestly, whether they think the bill has a decent shot to make things better, or whether the bill will actually make things worse, or whether the bill's gamble is too much of a gamble. And on this one, I think it is so close. And I also think we're operating, as we talked about, it's basically an information vacuum. That's the scariest part of this bill, is that it's based on these projections that because there's so much fossil fuel expansion in it, the projections are hard to really trust. Even the people who are making the projections will acknowledge all sorts of different variables and factors. And because it's not just a clean climate bill, we know it's a gamble. So I think on this bill, it's very difficult to discern how much better or whether it will even make things better.
Well, isn't that a reason for Bernie to, I don't mean to be putting it all on Bernie, but for him to go ahead and shoot the hostage in this.
Listen, I agree. Yeah. Bernie Sanders does not have the power that he should have because he's not been willing to do what Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are willing to do. And I think on this bill, it was a very close call. But here's the other thing I want to add, because this is really important. I think there's about to be another situation very quickly.
Oh, really?
On the side deal. The side deal to vastly expedite fossil fuel permitting. The scuttle is that what's going to happen is that they're going to add that side deal into what's known as a continuing resolution. Those are the stopgap budget bills that keep the government open while the Congress is negotiating its final regular annual budget for the government. And if they do that, here's what the situation will be. They'll put the pipeline bill into that. Then they'll come to the floor of the House and Senate and say, listen, you got to vote for this or the government's going to shut down. And you got to vote for this with this vast expansion of oil and gas pipelines in it, essentially undermining the National Environmental Act that's been on the books for 30, 40 years. And I think at that point, if the progressives in Congress, Bernie Sanders, whoever else in the Senate, aren't willing to say, listen, we are not voting for this, for a continuing resolution, unless it is a clean bill, as they call it, meaning none of this crap put onto it. It's just to keep the government open for whatever. That is the point where if they can't stand up even on that, then I think it really does say they're not willing. They're like ideologically against wielding the power that they have.
I mean, David, I don't have to tell you that a lot of people listening to this podcast are well beyond the point of thinking that they are not ideologically willing to
Yeah,
do
what I mean
needs
is
to be
it's not
done.
right. It's not a calculation on the merits. We're like, I think that could end up being like sort of another proving moment of like,
Yeah,
we're
but
not weighing the good and
David,
bad. We're like literally not, we're not here to do that. Like that's just not what we will ever do. And we definitely, look, moving forward, we definitely need a lot more people in Congress who are willing to actually play hardball.
But David, how do we even? But David, come on! Like this is the issue, and many people were upset about Bernie Sanders going on TV last week and saying exactly that. Like at the end of the day, we had a few more people that are on the good side of things. We'd get the votes.
I think the lesson to be learned here is that we need to elect 2, 3, 4 more Democrats in this midterm election. So in fact, we can go forward. Let me follow up on that. Way.
But David, you were here. You were here when the rest of us were in high school or middle school or whatever, watching what went down with Barack Obama and his 60 vote margin. I mean, I was in college, or law school, but like we all, we know what happened when Barack Obama had the 60 vote filibuster proof margin, and we were in this exact same place. So people don't have the confidence that anything different will change with a few more. What are you really saying? 60 more, 70? What's the number?
I'm with you. I don't have I don't have a lot of confidence either.
Here's the thing. This bill, it seems to me, I'm not trying to pretend like it's absolutely nothing of value, but that is a game I'm not interested in playing. Okay, marginal difference. Okay, the guillotine comes halfway through my neck. Congratulations. Like I guess that's better than completely severing my head off. What I'm frustrated by and what I'm curious about is the fact that this bill, more than other bills, seems to be largely about the political win that helps Biden carry himself over into not having a disastrous midterm season. This bill combined with
I don't actually agree with that. You know why I don't agree with that?
Yeah.
I don't agree with that because there are provisions in this bill that if they I can't believe I'm saying this, but at another level, this bill isn't political enough in that way. By that I mean, if you really wanted this bill to help you in the midterms, you'd put the child tax credit in it. If you really wanted this bill to help you in the midterms, you wouldn't put off the Medicare negotiating drug prices provision, the popular provision, to 2026. Right? Like I actually think that's actually the bizarre part of this bill to me.
But David, that's the thing. It's like these people think that the symbolic how it's being sold. They think
any win,
symbolic,
a win. Right.
Exactly. Right. When you turn on Pod Save America or any of these other shows, what they're talking about is like they're listing out this quote unquote wins, the slam dunks of the Democratic Party. Biden put out some little video where they're like ticking down a list of bullet pointed items that he's claiming credit for going into the midterms. And I think again, it's this knowledge asymmetry. They're banking on the fact that you don't actually have to deliver in a way that anybody feels before 2026 or whenever, or that actually manifests in a substantive way. They can crow about having child poverty, getting rid of that, and like just pretending like memory holing the idea that they just doubled child poverty and refuse to have it again. Like all of that is true because to them it's like this messaging bill, and they get to say that they did an infrastructure bill. That's part of why they named it an infrastructure bill, even though, as Bernie got in trouble for saying, it doesn't actually. Sorry, not infrastructure. Inflation. Even though it doesn't do much of anything to actually curb inflation.
Right, but let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, here's a question that I've wondered about. Does the real world matter? Or does the only thing that matters is the narrative? And by that I'm asking, I'm genuinely asking, I want to live in a world where the real world matters. In other words, if you bring down child poverty or you increase child poverty, that is salient to how people vote.
Yeah.
Or do we live in a world where the only thing that matters in how people determine how to vote is just the narrative? My team got a win, the other team got a loss. I think we have a problem in this world where there's an argument to be made that political outcomes are becoming unmoored from what's actually going on.
Well, I think there's a reason for that. And it has to do with the Democratic strategy and the party's explicit decision to court more affluent voters and ignore working class poor voters who don't vote in as high numbers. Because the people who are going to feel the impact of the real world, as you put it, and potentially vote differently as a consequence of their life being improved for the better are already written off as the Democratic Party as not as important as the upper class, affluent, richer voter who is routinely, consistently at the polls, whose life cannot really be made, it cannot really be made better in those exact same ways, aren't going to be touched by these policies that are really aimed at people who are struggling.
I think
more.
we're saying the same thing. I think that in the short term, the narrative, if you will, the kind of manufactured narrative can create a kind of sense of political and media momentum into a given short-term election.
Yes.
But I do think over the long term,
the narrative is going to be prioritized over the substantive because of the strategic choice the Democratic Party has made to court a different kind of voter, a more affluent kind of voter.
Yes. The Democratic Party, I would agree with you, it's a subject for a longer discussion, but has effectively decided that the courtable swing voter is the affluent suburbanite and not the working class person. And by the way, Chuck Schumer, to be clear, made that very clear, made that explicit in 2016 when he said, this is on the eve of the 2016 election, where he said, for every one working class Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we'll get 2 suburban Republicans outside of Philadelphia, and we'll replicate that in state after state after state.
For every blue collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin.
In 2016, that didn't work. And I would argue long term, that doesn't make mathematical sense. There are just a lot more working class people than there are kind of affluent bougies, right? I mean, it just doesn't work out mathematically.
Yeah. And I got to tell you, people have various thoughts and feelings about the approach that I'm experimenting with over at the Hill and trying to talk to a different kind of audience. But what I experience and what I feel every day in the context of not just preaching to the choir, but trying to figure out what is motivating an increasingly large group of independent voters who feel very disaffected from both political parties, is that the thing that's motivating people the most is the knowledge, the perceptible knowledge that the political parties are indifferent to them and what comes out of their actual outcomes. And all of this like hand waving about stuff that feels superficial. Oh, Democrats got a win. Oh, there was a bill. Oh, Karine Jean-Pierre is going to argue with you about whether or not you should be feeling good about how your life is going or not from the pulpit in the White House and an elite institution. That is not going well. And all of those disgruntled people, all those people living paycheck to paycheck, like a plurality of Americans, they're finding somewhere else to go. And you can write them off and say, oh, they're just racist and we're never going to get them anywhere or whatever. But I haven't forgotten the Obama to Trump voter. It's not about whether or not they're racist, but at some point they voted for your ideological agenda as opposed to the fascist ideological agenda. And you are not, I just will say this to the world, you are not a better person for being indifferent to the shift that's happening under our eyes. And to me, the way that you stop the shift in part is not by letting the Democratic Party off the hook, because they are setting up this disastrous parade of horribles. They're setting themselves up to fail.
I absolutely 100% agree. I 100% agree. And I think now moving forward, let's go back to climate for a second.
Yeah.
I think moving forward, I think one thing is absolutely true, that no matter what happens in the political electoral arena, going back to just climate science, this bill sets up a frantic race. It sets up a frantic race between renewable energy and a transition to sustainable energy that actually reduces carbon emissions, and a race to exploit as much fossil fuels as possible and condemn the world to levels of warming that are not really sustainable for essentially human life. And I think that that's the thing I'm most focused on and frankly worried about, is that now we're entering a new political era where this must be the worst climate bill that has ever passed in terms of comparing it to future climate bills. Because if it's not, if this is the best it gets, we are really, truly ecologically screwed.
Yeah. Well, David, look, I always appreciate you coming in, explaining on a granular level what's going on. And before you said, I don't want to get into too much into the weeds here. No. People, what I have experienced is the audiences really appreciate being leveled with and having folks, walk them through it because it feels empowering to them. And I'm not saying that every sentence of it stays in people's head for the long term. But people really appreciate, audiences, I think, can handle a lot more than they're.
Look, I totally agree. I mean, the thing that's kind of been disconcerting to me in this whole thing is, I mean, I said this to a friend. I think I said it to Adam McKay, who co-wrote did Don't Look Up, and I said to him, I said, I don't understand why every story about the climate bill doesn't include what the International Energy Agency just said to the world. The International Energy Agency, by the way, not a sort of liberal lefty group. It's a relatively conservative international body, well-respected, been around for decades. It said no more fossil fuel development if the world has a chance to meet agreed upon emissions targets. So my point is, I said, I guess it's not shocking because we wrote the movie Don't Look Up, right? So I guess I can't be shocked having written about a kind of Don't Look Up world. But it's sort of like we're here now, and people are writing about a bill that expands oil and gas leases and will expedite fossil fuel pipelines. And somehow not written in the next sentence is scientists are telling us not to do this, right? I mean, like I kind of feel like a character in our movie. Like, how are we still here? How is that not at least part of the conversation?
Yeah. And for your troubles, David, as you know all too well, I feel like Adam McKay is the new Bernie Sanders, where people are like, oh, the biggest mistake he ever made was teaming up with David Sirota. Obviously, the biggest mistake Bernie ever made was teaming up with the two of us. But I don't know. I feel a little differently. I value you extremely deeply, David. I can't say that enough. Your contributions to the left political space, to the discourse, to our more substantive understanding of what is going on in our world you cannot put a dollar amount of value amount on it. I encourage everybody, please, to go to subscribe to The Lever. Do you pronounce it lever or lever, by the way?
We do. We pronounce it lever. I guess folks in England produce it lever.
Okay. Well, head over to The Lever. Please do follow and subscribe and support that output. I know that I do. David, can you tell people where to find it?
Sure. Levernews.com. We also have our podcast. You can just, on any podcast app, search Lever Time. Every week we go through some of this stuff, and you'll hear me get angrier and angrier, sometimes despondent, sometimes hopeful.
All right. Well, thank you as always for your service, David. And to all of those listening, this is a bi-weekly podcast. You can listen to this free Thursday episode, but also subscribe for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast to get an additional Monday episode. And of course, you get full video with that premium Monday episode, just like you do with these Thursday episodes. Don't forget to go over to Bad Faith YouTube and subscribe, click the notification bell. It really helps us to beat the algorithm. The algorithm is brutal these days, so we appreciate all of your support. And as always, take care of yourself and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.